Alright guys, VLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm finally talking about my spoiler-filled thoughts on one of my most anticipated games, not just of the year, but really of all time, and that is the sequel to God of War 2018. Here we'll be talking about God of War Ragnarök, which I am someone that believes that God of War 2018 is one of the best games ever made. I think it is a true masterpiece, where again, I had very high expectations coming into Ragnarök, and Ragnarök is a great game. It is a very good continuation of God of War 2018, expanding upon that game in almost every conceivable way, though despite that, after having finished the game, which again, I just finished it last night at the time of this recording, I can't help but feel underwhelmed. And to be honest, I can't quite put my finger on it just yet. Where God of War Ragnarök, to me, again, gameplay wise, it is an improvement in pretty much every way. The scale of the game and its narrative is much grander. However, I feel like those are also my issues with it. It is a much bigger, grander game to the point where it has more flaws because it's a much bigger and grander game. And through that, it should be commended. They were still able to execute a very well-told story here, but through that, I do think comes also some downsides in the sense that I do think it is less focused than God of War 2018. But even beyond that, it also feels a bit more baseline, to where I feel like God of War 2018 is a story that gets better and better the more you analyze it. I feel like it's a story that has so much hidden complexity to it and so much meaning to it that I'll be honest, at this point, I don't know if I get that from Ragnarök. Now again, this could change. Again, this is immediately after I finish the game, but I don't feel the same way I did with 2018. But again, this is me sounding so negative when I did still love this game. I do think God of War Ragnarök is a fantastic game. I was riveted the entire way through, excited to see how the story was going to end, and while I did have issues with how the story was paced and how certain elements of the story were handled, I still did really enjoy my experience through it. Now, normally with these style of videos that I do, I like to focus on the gameplay initially. However, straight up, I don't feel like I have that much to say, and I think a lot of that comes from the fact that, again, this is just more of God of War 2018. Now, I'm not saying, like some of these people, that, oh, this is just a glorified DLC, because I think that's idiotic. Again, this is a steady progression of God of War 2018, but I do think the problem is, again, I think 2018 was such a focused game to where it felt like everything within that game had a reason. It felt like the reason why certain things were executed the way they were because they had some sort of meaning to it, where I feel like God of War Ragnarök here simply does it because they did it in the previous game. But again, a lot of the base gameplay is the same. Again, a similar combat system. A big pro here is that there is more enemy variety, which I do think was one of the big missteps with the original game. I will say I do hate the UI in this game. I do think the menus are just a pain to navigate through, and that's something I don't like. But again, as a whole, it is simply a good game. It is very well made. It is more of God of War 2018, but better. But again, I do think these things' connections to its narrative purpose is something that is a bit lacking here. And with that, let's talk about the narrative, where again, like, I am still largely conflicted on it. Obviously, there are a lot of positive attributes of its narrative. I do think it's a narrative that the core plot points are very strong, but I'm still a bit mixed on how exactly they got there. But really, my biggest criticism of it is the fact that the pacing of this game is extremely off. Not just in the fact that it is too slow or that it is too fast, but in the fact that it is both. There are portions of this game that really drag on, that really make you feel like they're just wasting time on screen, while there's other points in the game that are extremely fast-paced that lead to extremely underdeveloped plot points. And it's really this conflict between the two that I do think greatly harms this overall narrative, despite the fact that there are so many great moments within it. And it does feel like this is the consequence of the series being shortened to 2 games instead of 3. It really does feel like this game should have been split into 2 games to further develop a lot of plot points, but it simply just isn't. But let's start off running through the main campaigns, which starts off with the Surviving Fimbulwinter mission, where we see Kratos and Atreus continuing off of 2018. with them still in Midgard going on a hunt, only for them to be attacked by Freya, instantly giving us this big set piece to start the game, but also introducing us to Freya's rivalry with Kratos and Atreus here. And while I do think Freya's performance as a whole across this game is very, very strong, I did feel like a lot of this came off as ridiculous. Again, I'm someone from 2018 that I get the thematic reasons for Freya's hatred of Kratos and Atreus, but I still find a lot of it kind of ridiculous. And I did feel like the fight sequence at the very beginning of this game came off very cartoony to me. But either way, we follow this with a pretty great scene of Atreus, who now takes care of some wolves, having to put down one of his Infernir, which obviously plays a factor later on in the story. But again, I did feel like this was a pretty emotional scene, one that you do really feel for Atreus here. But while Atreus goes off to bury Fenrir, we do end up getting a dream sequence from Kratos where we finally get to see Faye, his deceased wife, who I will say as a whole, her role in this story greatly underwhelmed me. Coming into this game, I had a lot of theories about what they could do with Faye in this game, and really they did none of it. Faye ends up showing up here for a number of dream sequences / flashbacks. They're technically flashbacks of her preparing Kratos for her eventual death, and these are nice scenes. However, I really thought Faye was going to play a role in the actual events of the main story. I was expecting Faye's plan to continue on into this game, where they're playing a major role into the setup to Ragnarok, but she just simply doesn't. And I did find myself largely underwhelmed by that. Following this, we do go out to find Atreus, leading to a lengthy section of tracking him down, only to find out that he has turned into a bear, obviously showing him not in control of his powers. Though we do get a great scene immediately afterwards of Kratos and Atreus starting their arcs in this game, with Kratos now bitter at Faye, thinking that she had used him, which obviously gets rectified by the end of the game, but also showing Kratos not fully trusting Atreus and going all out to protect him here, which only ends up furthering the separation between the two. But eventually, after returning back to their cabin, we end up finally getting the scene that was in the epilogue of the original game, where Thor arrives. Which, I mean, you would have expected this to instantly lead into a fight sequence, but instead they end up sitting down at the table, and this is a pretty tense scene, all leading up to the arrival of Odin, who is obviously the main antagonist of this game, and instantly comes off as more smarmy sort of guy, this guy that is clearly duplicitous, but also is able to hide a lot of that to the point where he does easily manipulate Atreus moving forward, essentially acting as this other father figure for him, falling for his manipulations due to Kratos' distrust of Atreus, which ends up pushing him away. But also, this is a scene that is probably better after the fact, where now, knowing that Tyr was actually Odin the entire time, this makes Odin an even better antagonist to me, of knowing that this entire scene here is essentially him manipulating Atreus and Kratos into going to look for Tyr, only to then be able to spy on them, which again is a great revelation after a fact. Though we follow this up with the actual Thor boss battle, again obviously something that is really awesome here, something that you definitely expected coming into this game, kind of being similar to the initial Boulder fight in 2018, of setting up the scale of this game. Obviously the fight ends up ending in a standstill for now, but eventually after Atreus shows Kratos what he knows, he does reluctantly agree to help Atreus find Tyr in an attempt to stop Ragnarok, which ironically actually causes it to happen, which is a lot of this game, considering the themes of predestination. And while the overall theme does counter that, a lot of the game is still set up in a way to make you believe in these prophecies, particularly the one about Kratos dying, which ends up playing a major factor in the story here. And also increases the tension for the player, thinking that Kratos is probably going to die by the end, which I will say I fully did think Kratos was going to die for most of this game. But then we enlist the help of Brock and Sindri in order to find Tyr, leading to us getting the base for this game in Sindri's house in the Realm Between Realms, but also us opening up realm travel, where we go to Svartalfheim in order to find Tyr's location. And Svartalfheim's a pretty cool location. Again, obviously a direct contrast to Midgard, which is now in Fimbulwinter, meaning that it is entirely covered in snow, while Svartalfheim is a very colorful and sunny area. But this is also where the game kind of opens up for the first time, where you do have some side quests that you can partake in. Though really plot-wise, this entire section of the game really just amounts to you finding Tyr, which it takes forever for you to get there. I mean, I'll be honest, I did get kind of annoyed by the end of this mission that it was still going on. But eventually we do find Tyr, which I was surprised was so early in the game to a degree. I mean, like, at the end of the day, it's like Tyr was revealed in the trailer, so it's like you wouldn't expect it to be that late into the game. But the fact that it was literally the second mission did surprise me. So obviously here Tyr doesn't end up being as expected. I mean, at the end of the day, he really doesn't, considering he's Odin. But even at this point, he comes off as a disheveled former god of war, one that wants to stay away from war and doesn't want to help in the fight against Odin, and really just Tyr really annoyed me throughout a lot of this game, if I'm being honest. I mean, the fact that we spent so much time trying to find him, and the fact that he doesn't help at all, just, again, kind of bothered me. But either way, Tyr could have been an interesting character here, though obviously he's really just a plot device for major twists later on. But after returning to the Realm Between Realms, we do get one of the more interesting aspects of this game, and something I am largely mixed on, where we find out that we get to play as Atreus, with Atreus now going off on his own due to Kratos pushing him away and due to Kratos not trusting him. So Atreus goes off with Sindri in order to try to recruit Freya, which does end up being ineffective. But again, this ends up being the first gameplay section with Atreus, to where I will say, just as a whole, like, I don't mind playing as Atreus. I do think his combat is pretty solid, but I also just really did not like a lot of these sections. Like, again, I think this is a cool concept. However, I do feel like most of the sections that you play as Atreus, while I do get their narrative significance, particularly later ones, as I do feel like this one was not that important, but really all of them just did not click with me. I feel like every single time I'm playing as Atreus, I'm just wanting to get back to the core story and getting back to Kratos, which I do think harmed the pacing of this game, especially the upcoming Atreus sections, as really this one is relatively short. But back to Kratos, we do end up traveling with Atreus and Tyr to Alfheim now in order to learn more about Ragnarok by finding a mural from Groa, who is the one that prophesies Ragnarok. And again, this section also goes on for a bit long. I mean, there are some interesting puzzles along the way, but again, it felt like a bevy of these puzzles all in a row that did get a bit tedious. But eventually, we do reach the mural that we're looking for and find out that the prophecy that Odin was told turns out to be false, in that Ragnarok will be led by this champion from Jotnar, which we obviously assume to be Atreus here. Though interestingly, again, in retrospect, this is also a pretty fun scene, as again, Tyr is actually Odin, meaning that Odin is now finding out the reality of the situation that he was lied to, and also realizes the importance of Atreus at this point. But also we get a bit of foreshadowing towards that, with him acting a bit out of character during this scene, and him losing his calm demeanor for a bit here. Now, also following this, we do get this pretty lengthy escape sequence from Alfheim that also leads to a boss battle against one of the elves. That was the first time I had any difficulty with this game, which I will say as a whole, I found this game to be more difficult than God of War 2018. I feel like in my original playthrough God of War 2018, I never really had that much difficulty over the course of the main narrative. However, there were definitely certain points in Ragnarok where I did. Mind you, this one was pretty simple once you actually were paying attention. But later fights did end up annoying me, but again, not a minor gripe there. But following this mission, we do unlock Alfheim and are able to fully explore it, which leads us to a pretty fun side mission here with Atreus that really shows Kratos' love for his son here, and us going out of our way to help Atreus help this creature underground, which I thought was a good side quest for them. And in general, I did find the side quests in this game to be better than the original. Where while the original did have good quests here and there, I did feel like the bulk of the ones that I did end up playing in this game had some pretty solid character moments for the characters involved. But following this, we get another Atreus section where he just randomly awakens in Jotunheim for some reason, being taken there by Agrabota, who, knowing Norse mythology, does later become Loki's wife. And I did like Agrabota. She was fine. Not really this like elite character by any means, but I did like this dynamic between Atreus and Agrabota, though at the same time, this section really went on for a while. And I will say this is probably the most egregious of the Atreus sections to me, where this one just went on and on and on and on. Like, you're literally playing as Atreus for over 2 hours here, for what could have easily been like less than 30 minutes of actual gameplay. I felt like a lot of this could have been side content, but here we do have Atreus learning about the mural that shows Kratos dying, and through that becomes even more resolute in now making it his goal to stop Kratos' death, which ironically leads to most of this prophecy coming true, with him later falling into the hands of Odin. But after a lot of wasted time, we do eventually find out Angrboda's purpose in her revealing that the giants have sealed themselves into these orbs, and Atreus is now meant to look after them, which I will say as a whole, this is another storyline that greatly underwhelmed me. Where yes, I know that these orbs do come into effect later in the story. However, I do also feel like there could have been so much more done here. Like, I am mind blown that the giants didn't play a role in Ragnarok. Like, I really thought that we were going to use these orbs to revive all these giants and have them play a role there, but it just simply doesn't happen. And while we're here, I might as well also say another theory that I really thought was going to happen as well was the use of time travel, where I was really expecting time travel to play a major aspect in this game's story, considering the fact that we already knew about Ragnarok transporting the world serpent through time. Like, I would have assumed that that would have been a major aspect too, but it just simply doesn't happen. And again, that's why I'm saying where, like, to me, there were these disappointments with this story. Not that it is bad, but there are these things I expected to happen that could have made this story a lot more complex in its nature, but instead they end up going for a more baseline story, which again is still not bad, but one that was a little more basic than I was expecting, which, to be fair, is my initial reaction to God of War 2018 as well. And again, over time, I have found a grown respect for the complexity of that narrative, so maybe the same thing will happen in Ragnarok, but at the point that we're at right now, I did end up being a little underwhelmed by that. But really, this chapter should have ended there, but instead we then have a massive section of dealing with Angrboda's grandmother, which again also goes on for a while. We get a bizarre boss battle against Angrboda's grandmother, who is an actual giant, and this just felt really ridiculous to me that this was a thing that was happening. Though I will say that the boss battle itself was actually kind of an interesting one that did take great use of Atreus' abilities. But finally we do return to Midgard, where Kratos ends up catching up to Atreus, only for Kratos to then be attacked by an unnamed Valkyrie, leading to a boss battle with them, only for this person to be revealed to be Freya, who Kratos does decide to spare, leading us into our next mission, where we work alongside Freya in order to destroy the curse that is on her, and in turn end up gaining her as an ally, which I do like this section conceptually. Again, I do think having Kratos and Freya re-solidify here and having them work together to take down Odin is definitely the ideal situation. Though I will also say that gameplay-wise, this section did also kind of feel like it dragged on a bit. Now, this does actually end up taking us to Vanaheim, which is another very beautiful location. Later, we meet up with Freya's brother, Freyr, who I found to be one of the weirder new characters here, one that I never really connected with, and one that I don't know if was necessary to have him in the game here. I feel like he is largely here due to, one, again, his connection to Freya, but then also his connection to Ragnarok. But again, a character that overall I could really just do without. Though again, a lot of this mission, while again, gameplay-wise did kind of drag on to me, I did really like a lot of this section in terms of how it bonded Kratos and Freya, with Kratos finally being able to talk about his background and it referring to a lot of previous games, which, I mean, can't come off as like dumb fan service, but overall I did like seeing this more developed Kratos being able to reflect on his past. And we also get this big boss battle to end the section, as you would expect, where Kratos and Freya work together. And bizarrely to me, something I really never expected, something that was so surreal to me, is that Freya becomes our companion from this point forward, where this never even crossed my mind. This aspect of Atreus and Freya being interchangeable as companions for Kratos across this game, where in the moments where Atreus is gone, Freya is your companion. Again, that is insane to me. Like, that was never even a possibility in my mind, but I did like that it did catch me off guard there. But also following this, we do get more side quests. These side quests that I actually really liked with Freya, that ends up rounding out her character and her relationship with Odin. But then when returning to the main story, we once again get another argument with Kratos and Atreus, which I will say again, like, it does get a bit tedious that this continues to happen over and over again. It's largely the same fight every time too, where like I get the thematic reasons for it, but again, like, it literally happens a handful of times over the course of this story. But this time it leads to Atreus running away. But eventually Atreus ends up being called on by Odin, to which he gets taken to Asgard, which again, another really beautiful location here. And here we do end up meeting a group of Midgardians that were taken in by Odin, namely Skuldir? Either way, this character that developers clearly wanted you to really like, but I never really got much from him. Either way, we end up having to climb the wall, which ends up being a lengthy section in itself. But eventually do end up meeting with Heimdall, who ends up becoming a major antagonist moving forward. One that clearly doesn't trust Atreus the entire time, and one that is kind of maniacally evil across this game. But eventually we do end up being taken to Odin himself, where we end up agreeing to work with Odin in order to piece together this mask that he has been dedicating his life in research of, which he plans on using it to uncover the greatest secrets of the world. And again, this is just largely a plot device here. I mean, a lot of the gameplay of Atreus moving forward is revolved around piecing this mask together, and it largely amounts to nothing. Now, I know it amounts to a thematic moment at the end of the game, which is a good moment. But again, did we need all of these gameplay sections revolving around putting this mask together? Not really. Though along the way, we do end up meeting Thor's daughter, Thrud, who ends up being a nice ally for Atreus here, being a mostly likable character. But again, eventually we are sent off to Muspelheim in order to find the first part of the mask, during which we are paired up with Thor, which again is so surreal that we're playing as Atreus with Thor as your companion. It's insane. But here we end up reconvening with Agrabota and learning about the prophecy of Sutor, which ends up playing a factor into the endgame, which again is another plot point that I feel like was largely forced. I didn't feel like this was absolutely necessary. I feel like it was just added there to add these connections to the Norse mythology of Ragnarok, while also increasing the scale later on, but didn't really play much importance into the actual core narrative. But following this, with now Kratos knowing that Atreus is in the hands of Odin, he ends up searching for the Nords in order to find out more about the prophecy, which leads to this really dumb section of navigating through Midgard and finding these locations, only to find out that they're dead ends, which we end up finding the real one on the third attempt, which again, like, feels very gamey. I mean, this just all felt pretty stupid and just a waste of time. But eventually we do end up meeting with the Nords, who, through doing so, end up further solidifying this notion that Kratos is going to die, again furthering the stakes of the narrative, also here introducing the concept that these prophecies are not true prophecies, and that the players still have agency in these situations, which the defiance of these prophecies obviously become a major aspect of the story moving forward. But here the Nords end up telling Kratos that Heimdall is preparing to kill Atreus, progressing the narrative, and Kratos now needing to find a way to kill Heimdall, leading to us needing to forge a new weapon, leading to a boring, lengthy section of navigating through tunnels and killing enemies, which is obviously fun. Though again, this mission has us traveling with Brock through Svartalfheim in order to find the forge, where he ends up crafting us a new weapon, and that being the Draupnir spear, which I didn't like using, I'll be honest. I did mostly use the Leviathan axe and Blades of Chaos more so than this, though this did open up new possibilities with puzzles, and also obviously just gives you an extra weapon in the game that's introduced, again, relatively late into the game here. So again, that's a cool aspect of it as well. I do find it weird that this weapon is like proposed as a thing that we need to kill Heimdall, though when we eventually get to the Heimdall fight, you can damage him with the other weapons as well, so again, it's kind of pointless in that sense. Though again, I do like that this is like continuing this trend for Kratos, and that is slowly reverting back to his old ways, but this time under the guise of doing so to protect his son. Following this, we do get another Faye flashback, this one showing them talking immediately after Atreus' birth, that has Faye telling him that they must be better, and again, feeling like this down point for Kratos' character, with him having completely lost Atreus, having reverted back to his old ways, and we do see his sorrow as he sits in his room alone, that ends up being a pretty emotional moment there. But after that, we return to Atreus for more mask hunting, which is great, obviously. But this sends us to Helheim, where we end up going alongside Thrud. Oh yeah, another section that isn't that integral to the story, though Atreus does try to plant some doubt in her mind over Odin, though it doesn't really seem to go anywhere here. But eventually the hunt ends up taking us to an interaction with Garm, this massive wolf from Norse mythology that can rip between realms, and Atreus ends up breaking his chains, letting him go, creating this massive mess for the other realms, showing Atreus' proneness to mistakes without Kratos, to where we have both of our characters now in low points, but this is where Atreus ends up asking Odin for him to be allowed to go home, giving us a reunion between Kratos and Atreus, which ends up being a great moment here. And really this entire mission ends up being really fantastic, of now Kratos having to travel with Atreus as they try to start Garm. And while again, narratively, this doesn't really do much from a pure plot perspective, as this is mostly a side journey, it does obviously develop these characters in a very satisfying way, making them both realize that they need each other. And as expected, we get a massive boss battle against Garm, who we do have to fight multiple times here, which again, it does feel a bit excessive. But again, this section ends with this great moment of Kratos finally trusting Atreus, with Atreus ending the fight by transporting the spirit of Fenrir from earlier in the game into Garm, being this great reunion for Atreus and Fenrir. We do get this great scene immediately afterwards, one of the best scenes in the entire game, of Atreus and Kratos fully reconciling, where they do end up making a promise of allowing each other's voices to guide them when they're not together, which ends up perfectly progressing their stories. Though here we do end up having Atreus say the line that, "I need to know that you'll be okay without me," which I actually thought for a second might mean that Atreus could die by the end of this, though obviously it just leads up to him leaving, but again, we'll talk about it. But following this, we do get a section that I didn't love. Again, another one that felt like a deviation from the main story, where while yes, it does technically progress it, I did feel like a lot of content within it was filler, in that Freya's brother ends up being kidnapped by the Aesir in Vanaheim, so we end up having to go back to Vanaheim to rescue him. So along the way, again, we do get some good moments between Kratos and Atreus, with their bond now solidified. We get introduced to this new day and night mechanic, which doesn't really play much of a factor. But the big moment of all this is the eventual boss battle against Heimdall, which is a pretty great boss battle. Obviously the start of the end game here, with Heimdall coming off as just so unlikable here, kind of similar to how the gods from God of War 3 were portrayed, to where it ends up being really satisfying to take him out here, though in turn obviously also setting up the events of Ragnarok, with Odin now having reason to retaliate. Though again, the eventual rescue of Freyr is just kind of weird, where we get this set piece of Kratos carrying him on his back as he runs through the jungle, and we end up escaping on his floating ship, to which it gets attacked, and one of the members of Freyr's army ends up sacrificing himself. And it's like, really, it's like, who cares? Like, yes, I know this is followed up in the side content and everything, but still, I did feel like for the most part, this mission felt like a massive deviation from the main story, where outside of the Heimdall situation, which could have been easily cleared up in like 30 minutes instead of the hour and a half that it took to play this mission, I did feel like just overall, again, this section did drag on a bit for me as well. But following this, we get to the final Soul Atreus chapter, where Kratos ends up reluctantly agreeing to allow Atreus to infiltrate Asgard on his own in order to steal the mask from Odin, which again shows the trust that Kratos puts into Atreus at this point. Though this also leads to another really insane scene, like one that is so surreal, of us having to go on this mission with Thor once again, but Thor is drunk in the bar next door, and we essentially get into a bar fight trying to get Thor to go along with us, which is like, what are we doing? Like, what a bizarre segment. I know that this segment is here like to progress the relationship between Thor and Thrud, and it's like, I get that aspect of it, but this definitely felt out of place in my eyes. But either way, we end up traveling to Niflheim in order to finish the mask, but eventually Atreus ends up stealing the mask, obviously burning his relationship with Aesir at this point. But this is obviously where we do get a bit of a plot twist, where having stolen the mask from Odin, we now just need a way to get to Asgard in order to defeat him, leading to Tyr out of the blue completely shifting in character and deciding to now start a war and revealing that he knows a way to Asgard despite never revealing this beforehand. To which Brock ends up being suspicious of him, only for Tyr to then reveal that, again, he is not Tyr, he is Odin. And he stabs Brock through the chest, killing him. But again, ends up being a cool reveal here. Again, initially I was a bit like, okay, this is kind of maybe a bit iffy, but I do think in retrospect it was nicely set up along the way. And I do think this Brock death, I never really expected, and was one that I think is done pretty well here. Again, it is this very dark outcome for Brock and Sindri, with Brock being unable to be revived due to having died beforehand, and obviously Sindri being grief-stricken for the rest of the game, being this sad outcome for these two characters that are typically comic relief characters. But this ends up being a major low point for Atreus' character, with him now realizing all the mistakes that he has made and thinking that he is the cause for all of these bad things happening, which, I mean, he is to a degree, but Kratos further motivates him to continue going, leading us to the penultimate mission, where now we are gathering all the troops in order to start Ragnarok. This did very much feel like an Avengers Endgame style of moment of getting these troops from all the different realms and gathering them together to lead this assault. And again, it just felt kind of generic-y to me. But here we do get some great moments between Kratos and Atreus, who go on their own to Muspelheim to recruit Surtur. Which, again, I said this earlier, like, this entire plot point feels pretty unnecessary. I don't think this was something that needed to happen outside of adding in this big threat that was going to cause a lot of damage at Ragnarok, where really they never end up utilizing Surtur here, where actually he ends up being an antagonistic figure for them by the end of it, with them having to stop the damage he's doing. And again, I get the thematic points of it, but I just feel like the time that we spent recruiting it felt like a waste of time, though the sequence does lead up to a pretty big boss battle, one that was strangely spoiled in the story trailer of us fighting against two Valkyries at the same time, which is a great fight, but one that, again, was weird that they spoiled a fight from this late in the game in the trailer, to the point where I was always expecting this fight to show up at some point, and it just never did until the very end. And by this point, it's trying to act as this is a big surprise, but again, they spoiled it in the trailer. But something annoying about this entire section for me is that immediately after this Valkyrie fight, you then proceed to still have to fight a bevy of enemies on your way back to the Mystic Gateway in a position where there are no shops along the way, making the path back extremely difficult to me. Then it just simply did not become a fun experience to fight these bevy of strong enemies without any solid resources. So again, I found that annoying, but that does take us to the end of the game. The final mission, the Realms at War, which has us meeting up with our army at Midgard, where Kratos is declared the general, and we get to see these different factions that are helping us, only for us to lead up to the final flashback sequence with Faye, which ends up containing her making Kratos promise to spread her ashes, obviously setting up the entire story, which again is a cool full circle moment, but again, I always expected Faye to have a much bigger role in this story than that. But either way, we start the assault on Asgard, which is obviously this massive set piece, as you would expect it to be, where we have to fight wave after wave of enemies as we near the wall. Though initially we are losing the battle until Sindri arrives to destroy the war weapons. And here we do get another great moment for the Kratos-Atreus relationship, where we do find out that Odin is essentially using these Midgardians that he had recruited in order to be this moral conundrum for Atreus and Kratos in order to slow them down. And this leads to a great moment of Kratos learning from Atreus here and realizing that there is another way here and that they don't need to kill these innocents, which again is a nice progression of their arc, fulfilling Faye's words from earlier of wanting them to be better. So yeah, I did really like the payoff to all this, though it does lead to our final Atreus gameplay section of us playing in his bear form and just destroying a massive wave of enemies until we interact with Thrud, who still thinks he's lying until Sif, her mother, arrives to tell her otherwise, which I will say I haven't mentioned Sif up to this point, but Sif is voiced by the same actress that played Elena Fisher, and it just bothered me the entire playthrough every time I heard her voice. But also, I feel like this was also a weird shift in character for Sif, who had constantly hated Atreus throughout the entire story. For her to be the one to end up saving Atreus here felt kind of abrupt. I mean, I guess you can say that, oh, she did it because she realized that Odin was using the Midgardians, but it's like also, like, she'd known for a while about how terrible of a person Odin is, and even says that here. So it's like, I don't get why this shift in character happened, but whatever. We then return to Kratos as, again, we fight a whole bunch of enemies on the way to the Great Lodge. But once there, we get the final boss battles in the game. We first fight off against Thor, which I will say was definitely the most difficult fight of the bunch to me. I did feel like Thor's fight was much more difficult than Odin's, where I felt like Odin's attack patterns were a lot more predictable just off the bat, where I felt like Thor was a lot more difficult to take down, though. This fight does end with a pretty nice moment of Kratos letting him live and getting Thor to recognize what Odin is doing. So we do have Odin arrive, to which Thor refuses to kill Kratos, which ends up being a nice redemption moment for Thor, only for Odin to then kill him. And being this big moment for Odin of him now becoming this definitive maniacal villain at the end here, where obviously, like, through the game up to this point, he had been shown as this manipulative figure. However, I feel like you could rationalize a lot of the things he was doing. I think at the point where he kills his own son, I think that's the point where you do have to let it go. But then we get to the final boss battles in the game here, where we have to take down Odin multiple times, though the first fight is more difficult than the latter. The latter feeling like it was just there for more story reasons and has you working with both Atreus and Freya, which definitely helps in the fight as well. But along the way, we get this great moment of, again, using the mask as this thematic message of Atreus could have all the answers if he just used the mask, but instead he ends up throwing it away, defying this theme of predestination. And we have this nice moment with the defeat of Odin, where it fulfills really all the characters here of Atreus using his magic to put his spirit into an orb. And while Freya has the opportunity to destroy him herself, she's able to let go of that, only for Sindri to be the one to show up and finally destroy Odin. And again, I feel like this wraps up these storylines all pretty well. Again, for Kratos and Freya, they're able to let go of their hatred. For Atreus, he's able to defeat Odin, but not in this ruthless way that would really go against his themes of his story up to this point. And then you have Sindri, who is now wanting revenge for the death of Brock, being able to finally finish Odin off, killing Odin, but in a way that, again, satisfies all these characters. So that is something I did really like. Though then we get the final escape sequence as Asgard is about to be destroyed, leading to Freyr sacrificing himself while the others escape, which, I mean, fine. Again, don't really care about him as a character. But Atreus gets knocked out along the way, and we awaken to really give us the epilogue of this game. We see the aftermath of this fight, and we play as Atreus as he walks up the mountain and interacts with all these characters one by one, essentially being able to say farewell to all these characters. But at the top, we have Atreus interacting with Agraboda, where Atreus reveals that he has something that he needs to do, only for Kratos to then show up, giving us the final bit of gameplay, and us reaching the peak of the mountain, finding a mural, which reveals that the entire story had been known from a mural. However, Faye destroyed it, defying the gods, in order to not give this information to Kratos and Atreus, essentially proving that Faye did love Kratos and was not using him, which again is a nice final moment here for Faye. But again, I wish she had more of a role here. But this is where we get this fantastic moment, this really emotional moment, obviously, this farewell between Atreus and Kratos. This moment where Atreus reveals to Kratos that he feels that he needs to leave and search for the giants, as it's his calling. And again, this is an extremely emotional moment. Obviously, we spend all of 2018 in Ragnarok now trying to protect Atreus. Now seeing Atreus grown up and able to go on his own, and Kratos have the trust in him to allow him to do so, is such a beautiful moment for these two characters here. And then we get the very end of the game, this final moment that I think is such a perfect conclusion to Kratos' character. and that is that Kratos looks at the back of the mural, finding an image of him being worshipped. Again, following up on a line that Odin gave earlier in the game of that no one has ever worshipped to him. And again, being this satisfying payoff for Kratos, this former god of war, this one that was filled with vengeance, now being the bringer of peace, this god that is adored by his people, is a really touching moment. And see Kratos getting emotional at seeing this possible outcome is a fantastic way to conclude this game, leaving us on this final shot of Kratos regrouping with Freya and Mimir as they look over the mountaintop, talking about rebuilding, again, setting Kratos on this path to become that god in the prophecy. Like, really a beautiful moment for Kratos' character. Again, in a way that I don't think we need another game. I think I am perfectly fine if there's not another God of War game ever. Now, I do think there's a lot to do with this universe. I do think there are obviously other mythologies to tackle. However, I don't know if we need it. I feel like Kratos' story feels done. Like, I don't know what there really is to do with Kratos to really progress his character at this point. And like, yeah, I think you could probably do something with Atreus' character, but I don't feel like it's necessary. Like, I really do feel like God of War should be done. The conclusion to this game is so beautiful, and I do really love the way that it's handled. Now, I should mention that after you complete the main story, there is also the Beyond Ragnarok quest, which is essentially just open world exploration. And there are a number of epilogue sequences that, I'll be honest, I have not played at this current point. I've not gotten around to playing most of the post-game content, but I do know that there is a funeral for Brock. There is the ability to find the real Tyr, which seems kind of pointless if I'm being honest. You can take down the new Valkyrie Queen, and I do have a lot of respect for the fact that they added all this stuff into the post-game. I think all these things like just further conclude God of War here to where I really just do not expect them to continue on with the series for the immediate future. And I just feel like, again, this feels like the perfect ending point for the series to me. But I mean, again, that is pretty much the entire game of God of War Ragnarok, a game that I did love. Like, I did really, really enjoy this playthrough, but I have a lot of nitpicks with this game. And again, a lot of that comes from the fact that this is a sequel to God of War 2018, this more linear, condensed, near masterpiece of a game, in a situation where I felt like a lot of Ragnarok kind of meandered a bit. I feel like there were points that sections dragged on, while other plot threads felt underdeveloped and rushed through. But again, in comparison to most other games out there, this is still an insane game. One of the best games I have played in years, just not to the quality of what we had in 2018 in my eyes. Again, it is a grander game. It is a bigger spectacle, but through that, it allows itself to have more flaws, which is what ends up being the underwhelming element of it. I do think at the end of the day, I do think 2018 is the better game, in the sense that, again, it is less flawed, and I do think it is a true masterpiece. While Ragnarok has issues, but is still an overall really great game, a great sequel to 2018, but one that doesn't quite replicate what 2018 did, end up being a step below 2018, but again, when you're a step below a masterpiece, it's still a very good game, which is kind of where I'm at with God of War Ragnarok here. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on God of War Ragnarok. Again, a very rambly video. This was literally me running through my thoughts as I ran through the story immediately after I finished it. But really, again, we'll be continuing the same sort of content I typically do on this channel, so stay tuned for all of those. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.